Hi there. I'm joined once again by Mark Martin from Schultz Miller Construction out in Seattle. And today we have a special guest, Kevin Flandreau from Definitive Audio. So Kevin, why don't you give us a little background on you, the services that you offer, and then we can get into talking about sort of the must-know technology when designing a new home.
Sure. So I work for a company in Bellevue, Washington called Definitive Audio. We're about a 50-year-old low voltage company that does automation and stereos, lights, shades, audio, video type of thing. We started off back in the 70s as a record store, basically that sold high-end 2-channel audio. About probably 15, 20 years ago, we started doing integration as it became more of a thing. And nowadays it's kind of a mainstay. And we have 2 retail stores, one in Seattle, one in Bellevue, and then my group, which is the custom group. So, and I've been here for 27 years now, which seems like forever.
And so, when it comes to designing a custom home, what are some of the things that your firm does?
Well, so we do design engineering, we do wiring schematics, elevation drawings, but I mean the big thing is, and like I was telling Mark about it, is the low voltage scope of a house tends to be something that is a complete design build, and it generally happens kind of later in the process because everybody focuses on the architectural elements of the house and what it's going to look like and what the functionality of it is, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, and by the way, like, do you want automated shades? Do you want lighting control? Do you want music? Do you want speakers? Do you want cameras? Do you want a gate? And so all of a sudden that kind of process starts again. And just depending on where we are in the process of building the house, it gives you more kind of runway to figure it out.
Yeah, and I can imagine that there's a lot that goes into each of those. Sort of which one do you think is like the most involved or the hardest to plan for?
The funniest thing is nowadays we'll do a budget for lighting control. Basically instead of having 6 switches in your kitchen to have a lighting design, a keypad that does a scene. We'll do a budget for that. We'll do a budget for shades, and then we'll do a budget for audio and video. And in general, on a larger custom house, they're kind of a similar kind of chunk each way. The audio video portion gets scrutinized by far the most because the designers and the architects and everybody in design with what it looks like want to know about the lighting control and the shades, and they love that stuff. And then the audio part, they're like, I need a TV on the wall with some speakers. And for us, it tends to turn into, what are you going to watch? What is your sources? What do you listen to? Do you like music? Don't you care? And of course, everybody always says, well, I can't tell the difference. But the nice thing about having a retail store is you can come in and within 10 seconds, I can play a music clip on 5 different speakers and everybody can hear the difference. Now, whether you want to do anything about it is completely another story, but everybody can tell the difference between the speakers.
Do you find that most of the clients or most of the people that you work with, when they're building a custom home, do they think about what it's going to be like when they're entertaining and having parties and wanting sort of speakers not only all throughout the house but out in the landscape as well?
A lot of them don't, right? And so that's part of the education process, and which is where we lean into help with the architect, help with the builder, because we've done. Whether this client builds a lot of houses, which realistically is one every 10 or 15 years, we do 6, 8, 10, 12 of these a year, and so you get feedback much quicker from clients than how they use the system, and so we tend to have ideas or ways that we think people are going to use the house or could use the house, and conveying those questions so that they understand it is realistically the hardest part of our job, to get them to understand how terrible it would be to have 3 switches in the bathroom, right? You have a light, wall sconces, and a fan. Well, when your clients, when your guests come over, they turn on the first switch in your entry powder, and then they use the bathroom, and if you're going to design this beautiful little room with all this custom lighting, it's nice that when somebody walks in, they push one button, it does that lighting scene of both fixtures. And then if they want to use the fan, you hit a button and it'll run for 45 minutes and turn itself off. So it cleans everything up and makes it function the way you intend it to function versus however, all the little sliders get moved around. And so it's a little bit more functional that way.
Obviously, Chris is the architect and I'm the builder. And what is kind of the process for a new build? So the contractor calls you or the architect calls and says, "Hey, Kevin, we've got a client and, they want an AV package." And I guess, how do you dissect that, and how do you go about just the modeling that and navigating that with a client that maybe, in Seattle, there's lots of tech. So you've got the Amazons and the Googles and the Facebooks and all of those companies. So how do you, what's your routine, I guess, or your program that you run through?
Well, the benefit of having a retail store with, media rooms, and we basically sell all three of the big commercial or the big control platforms. We sell Crestron, we sell Savant, we sell Control4.
And go back and tell what does that mean as far as what are those?
So basically, if you're going to build a house and you're going to have a gate or a doorbell, and you're going to have security cameras, and you're going to have HVAC, you're going to have lighting control, a swimming pool, distributed music, distributed televisions, you can either have an app for each of those, or you can buy a platform like Crestron, Savant, or C4 that basically integrate and kind of aggregate all of those different functionalities into one app. So if you travel a bunch and you're building a house and you want to be able to go to one spot and see if shades are open or closed, if the heat's on or off, what the temp on the pool is the gate open, or have somebody call you from the gate and be able to operate it, those functionalities kind of come from those platforms. And so for me, with a client, whenever they're starting, whether it's big or little, it's always best to get kind of the builder and the architect and the clients into the store, because I've got lighting control that I can show you what a keypad looks like. I can show you what in-ceiling speakers look like. I can play them for you. I can show you what invisible speakers look like. And then, because the biggest thing, most of these clients have never really done it before. So, for me, when you get a client that did a custom house 10 years ago and now they're doing a new one, it's great because they know what they did and didn't do or liked. And so for them, it's always a quicker kind of launch into what are the things you did do or didn't do that you wanted. And usually things like lighting control are one of those things people are like, I don't need lighting control. But it's the first thing that once you move into the house, you realize for, whatever, 10 grand, I could have done everything and it would have just been cosmetically, it all looks the same. Functionally, I can hit a button and turn everything off. And so there's a lot of executable stuff. And what I mean by executable is at 9:00 at night, I have all the driveway lights turn on. At 2 a.m., I had them turn off. If the security system goes off, I have the exterior lights turn on. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do once you have all these little systems. Once you tie them all together, I can do, a crazy amount of stuff. It gets a little overwhelming, which is the hard part, right? If you get somebody that's never done it and you're like, oh, hey, by the way, when you come home and your automatic gate opens because it's your car, do you want me to turn the lights on in the hallway and the kitchen if they're not already on? And people, of course you do, but it's just, there's so many layers of, how do I figure it out? And so it quickly spirals into all of these decisions. And so that's why earlier kind of easing into it and then let them kind of come back and what about, what if I did this? Could I have it do this? And so there's a lot of that functionality that once you have the system, I can always change it and modify it moving forward. But if you don't put it in to begin with or kind of wire for it, then you're stuck.
I can imagine there's a lot of overlap between the work that you're doing while the house is under construction and the work that an electrician's doing. Is there a lot of overlap? Who takes over the sort of the charge of installing all that wiring and switches and stuff like that? Because normally it might fall under the electrician's scope, but now once you have an AV specialist, I'd imagine a lot of that goes to you.
And that's where like Mark and I mean, we just bid on a project, right? We're proposing lighting control. So it's all of the parts that basically turn the lights on and off, but we do a design of where they all go, what programs to which circuits, and then we install the keypads, which is low voltage, and then the electricians install all of the parts and pieces. So if you think of a, kind of a normal house like you and I have, I've got 3 switches in my kitchen. Well, I can retrofit a keypad in one of them and then dimmers in the other 2. And then the keypad gives me the ability to do that scene. So at that point, what I would do is I would do the design and then I would hand the parts to the electrician. He would put them all in for us. And then we do the programming so that moving forward, if the client wants to augment things or change things, we can do that either remotely or with them. But yeah, there's a lot of interaction between the subs.
One of the things I hear constantly from our clients is that they just want things to be simple. And some of simplicity requires a little bit of complexity to get to that point. But one of the things, I guess, Kevin, that might be interesting to talk about is that you talked about the new construction, but also on the remodel. So there are options, and I think one we've talked about is radio raw and probably some other options. But what do you see in the retro market for clients that maybe didn't spend the money on the front end or bought a pre-existing home? What are the options for that?
Well, we're a big Lutron house. We sell a lot of Lutron, and they make a great raw 2, raw 3 now. They make battery powered shades that are palladium, which is an exposed roller. So if you have a more modern looking house, you see the actual shade roller, and the bracket is very tight, and it's a battery powered shade. Or they make one it's about a 5-inch tall box that's fabric coated that you can inside of a kind of a more traditional look. And then all the keypads and switches all get retroed in exactly where old ones are. They make what they call a hybrid dimmer. So it's a keypad that can take over a dimmer, and then you replace dimmers as needed. And then 3-ways, they make a little $50, kind of throwaway that just fills the hole. But then, like I say, the benefit is you create really a lighting control system with the keypads. So as long as you just use the keypads, if I walk in and somebody messes with the dimming loads, it doesn't matter. If I hit that button, it does what we pre-programmed it for. So, my 1979, brass and brown house down the street, I put lighting control in it 10 years ago. And, the driveway lights come on at a certain time. The house lights on the rock come on, for all night. The, yard lights turn on and turn off. And I've got a button at the bottom of the stairs that turns off all the lights for the kids' rooms upstairs. And so there's a lot of that functionality for $10,000 to $15,000, $20,000 that you could put into a retro aspect of a house, and then some battery powered shades, and all of a sudden it's pretty compelling. I mean, it's a neat solution.
Well, that's so interesting. What about the space that all this AV equipment takes up? How much space do you need?
Well, nowadays with networking and for example, we're doing a project right now that the guy does not want integration. So he had a system from years ago, and he's just like, I just want Sonos amplifiers and speakers, and I want cable boxes at the TVs, and then I want Lutron lights and shades. But we still have a 2-foot square by 6-foot tall rack in a kind of a conditioned closet downstairs that we have some lighting control panels in, and the security parts and pieces are in there, because he still has 5 cameras. He still has 10. The Sonos amplifiers, you need to put them somewhere. And if I can keep everything in one spot, the benefit is moving forward, whatever comes out 10 years, 20 years down the road, if it's all in one spot, I can infinitely change it into something like home control, or keep it separate like it is just with new versions. So it definitely gives you more flexibility going forward. But a regular kind of middle Atlantic or that style of rack is roughly 2 feet square. And it's nice to have it somewhere that it's either ventilated well. I told Mark yesterday, I said, electronics tend to be people, if you keep it in like the 70s, everything's happy. If you put it somewhere and it's, 85 or 90, they don't love it. But it's the hard part in our industry too, is to find spots in some of these custom houses where nobody wants to design a storage room. Everybody wants, kitchens and bathrooms and, entertainment spaces. And all of a sudden you're like, well, where does the furnace go? And so we're kind of in that ballpark too.
I think that's a good way to look at it. I mean, it's almost basically the furnace room for AV. So there's 2 parts to it. There's the local equipment. That'll be your TV, your DVR, your Roku box, or whatever that might be. And that'll be at the source, which is where you're actually using the remote, the TV. But then everything else is routed to an equipment room, or like Kevin said, a closet. And the house we're doing right now, we're actually putting in a mini split air conditioner in there, because I've been on projects where when the equipment hits 90 degrees, it becomes really fussy. There's a ton of technical errors that come up through this heat. So, I think, Chris, for your team and planning for the space, even if you're going to use it for storage later, it's always good to have room that's like vented to the outside, as Kevin mentioned, or separate cooling, because it needs it year round, not just at the not just in the summer times, because the equipment just puts off so much heat. So we always try to build at least a 5x7 room somewhere in the basement, to be able to house the lighting control panels and then the AV racks.
And is the basement a good spot for that, or I would have thought that like you might want it more central to maybe like the living room area, sort of in a closet behind the wall of a living room, maybe, into a bedroom.
Central, yeah. Central's always the best case scenario, but again, nobody wants to give up a 5x7 room, next to the living room. They're like, no, that's going to be, pantry. That's going to be. So generally we get stuck in the basement.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
Which is fine. Again, with networking becoming a way bigger part of systems, Wi-Fi and things like that, having all the network switches in a location, just so that we can update as things go by, because it's, Wi-Fi 6 is out now, and the range on Wi-Fi 6 is not near what Wi-Fi 5 was, for example. And we generally try not to do any kind of a mesh network. That's something that you can do. It's kind of like doing, if you can do wired network for all of your components, televisions and printers and whatever you can always start with wired if you're doing a new job, and then you can add things Wi-Fi if you have to later. So we try to at least kind of hide some areas where we know, in closets, for example, we can put a little single gang and run some extra cats to it, so that you're just for future proofing stuff. Those are always good solutions too.
One of the things Kevin mentioned is that Wi-Fi is probably the single most important feature of these homes. It's when your guests come over, they want to have access to it. Your family members, just about every person that comes to the home. Kevin, maybe switching off the lighting control and the shades, maybe tell us a little bit about speakers. And I think that's something that we can all, when we, and then maybe back even up a little further about Sonos and how that relates to, the speakers and the systems, because I think that's what we all hear and can understand.
Sure.
So what maybe like the different levels of speakers, and you mentioned the invisible, the phantom type speakers, and what's out there for people to listen to.
Well, I mean, for Sonos was a game changer, because previous to Sonos, you had to have some big amplifier with, switching. And with Sonos, when they came out with their little amp, basically I can plug that thing in and I can wire it to a pair of speakers, and I can go to my phone and I can play music, any streaming apps I want. I don't have to go to a wall panel. I don't have to have any control. The bad part about it is if you want to use that system for other things, then you kind of get to a point where it becomes harder to integrate it with bigger systems. But if you can play kind of with what it does, which is if I plug a TV into it, I can use that as a source, or if I can use it for an app on my phone, because they don't even make a remote anymore. You only use the app. But it's a great solution for most people if you're doing something kind of in the mid to entry level stuff. Once you get over, I want 10 pairs of speakers, it gets a little clunky, just because if you've ever gone to the Sonos app, it basically line lists all of the rooms. And when you start scrolling through, 15 different zones, it gets a little overboard, but it's still a great solution.
Those are in ceiling speakers that not to be confused with Sonos also offers kind of a plug and play visual speaker, right. Bookshelf type, which are great too. But this is things that are integrated into the house, built into the infrastructure, and in ceiling or in wall type applications. Yeah.
I mean, the original parts that Sonos came out with was a speaker that you would plug into power, and it would sit on your wireless network and you could stream to it. Obviously, as a custom integration guy, I tend to gravitate more towards integrated speakers with a custom amplifier. They still make speakers that plug into the wall, and our retail stores sell tons of them. It's literally, Sonos is the number one brand of things that we sell. By a lot, which I was completely blown away from. But again, I don't work in the retail store, so my jobs are, generally either new construction or remodeled or, some kind of a takeover. So what I put into houses tends to be different than what the guys in the store see. But I was blown away. We sell more Sonos by far than any other parts, which is cool. And then as far as speakers, the cool thing about speakers is probably 10 years ago, we started to see some of these invisible speakers, which basically they were a speaker with a sheet of paper over the front of them. And they sounded like this. They're terrible. About 2 or 3 years ago, a couple of the different manufacturers and Sonance, which always kills me. Sonos and Sonance have done a deal. So if you go to Sonos's webpage, they'll have Sonance speakers kind of as a package. It's the same speakers that we sell from Sonance. It's just they've done a packaging deal. But they basically sell the same thing, an amplifier and a pair of Sonance speakers, whether they be small aperture or what they call architectural. So they're trying to create something that has a smaller footprint in the ceiling. And then they make invisible speakers now that, again, they get put in and they get drywall around, like a patch. And they sound really good. They just don't play very loud. That's kind of their big drawback. They have a great dispersion pattern. They're great for background noise, entryways, entry powders, closets, areas like that where you just want music and you don't necessarily want to know where it's coming from. They're awesome. And of course, you can't see them. So they're great that way. Small aperture speakers have become a much bigger kind of part of the mix lately, mostly because of the architectural aspect. I guess the good news, bad news is they're small, but instead of using an 8-inch pair of speakers that are, a 10-inch grill, you end up with 4 of these 4-inch speakers at $1,900 a piece. And so to spread it out, because when you get smaller speakers, you don't get near the coverage you get out of one regular speaker. So there's a whole kind of game you play with, what do I want it to look like? What do I want it to sound like? Where's the budget land? And then how do I get to the final equipment eventually? There is a new product that just came out. There's a company called Wisdom Audio. They use a panel, like a planar panel for their tweeter. And the big issue with a lot of small aperture speakers is when you load a regular speaker into, a can, basically, you get more of a shotgun style sound, which is why they do multiples. Whereas Wisdom, because their tweeter is basically a flat panel, it's right by the entrance. So the dispersion pattern's significantly better. But anyhow, yeah, there's a lot of that coming out. It's intriguing. I mean, it looks nice. It sounds good. It costs more. And it becomes a little harder to, figure out where it all goes and make it all look right. But it's funny to me that the architectural folks would rather have, 6 of these 4-inch holes in the ceiling than 2 10-inch holes. Because that's really what the change off is, right? It's like, we have them in our room here and I look up at the ceiling and it looks like, someone was trying to shoot a rat in the ceiling. There's just holes everywhere. I have my opinion on what I like the look of, but you never know what architectural changes come down the pipe. We're working on a house right now that the architect, a very world famous architect, told the clients that they should get bookshelf speakers and just put them next to the fireplace. And I'm like, instead of putting them in the ceiling? And he's like, yeah, they want to do bookshelf speakers. I did bookshelf speakers back in the 90s. They sound great, but apparently it's coming back. So there you go.
Maybe they're going for like a whole little retro look to it.
It's a super modern, steel glass, very modern house, and the ceiling is all wood panel. I was like, well, they're putting lights in the ceiling that are square and they're 4-inch. We've got small aperture that are square and 4-inch. We can do that. And then the architect said, no, we'll just put them in the blackened steel shelving next to the fireplace.
Going back a little bit to invisible speakers, because I don't know if everyone knows what invisible speakers are. So why don't you just like a base level explanation on what is an invisible speaker?
Basically, what they do is they take a piece of wood and they mount multiple drivers to it, and they put a piece of paper over it, basically like drywall paper over it. And then when you put it in the ceiling, you basically cut a hole in the drywall and you mount the thing. And when they build it, it's actually cupped from the outside in. So when you put it in, you basically level it so that the outside is shrunk a little bit, and they basically just mud around it. And so it just looks like the ceiling.
So it just has the paper from the drywall, and then you mud around the seams and you paint it just like you would the wall or the ceiling, and it's right there behind it.
We do a lot of times, like I did a house for a guy who's, he's a little older. And of course, the designer didn't want any speakers in the wall. and the ceilings are 20 feet tall. And he's like, I can't hear the TV because the speakers are so far away. So we did invisible speakers basically at head level in the wall that are invisible. And so when we turn on the TV source through the automation, we can play the speakers for the TV sources through the wall significantly louder than the ones in the ceiling. So when they do music, it plays from the ceiling. When they do TV, it plays from the wall. And for him, the funny thing is the big issue is where are they going to put art? Because obviously you can't put them where you're going to hang a picture over them. And wherever you put them, you got to make sure that 10 years down the road, somebody doesn't go like, oh, hey, let's hang a picture here. Because that'll ruin them too. So figuring out where we could put them and kind of, how low could we get them and how close. But I mean, they worked out great and he loves them. But, it's one of those things that it's hard for us because like I said, I do 10 of these a year. And so I get to try a lot of stuff. And when you kind of run into solutions where you're like, oh, this would be perfect. And then the hard part for me is to explain to the client or the GC contractor or the architect or whoever, like, you need to do this, and here's why. Shades, for example, when you do exterior shades, a lot of companies, there's a third-party company called Somfy. They use an integration platform called an ERTC. It's a wireless transmitter. Well, it's a pain. If I do a different version of a shade, I can basically use a Lutron power module with it, and I can make it work exactly like a Lutron shade. But if the shade guy from outside is a third-party guy, he just wants to put in a shade and make it work. And then I have to figure out how to integrate it into a button to make it open close. So there's stuff like that I could probably do a better job conveying when you're in this process, because there are a lot of other subs that we have to deal with, how it gets installed, what it looks like, how it's going to work. And, a lot of times everybody's like, oh yeah, it'll be the same. And it's like, well, it'll kind of be the same. And, I've done it both ways. And so you kind of pick a way that you think is more reliable. And long-term, I think is a better solution. So you just keep going.
Yeah. Two other things I thought were cool about speakers is that, oftentimes we'll put one in the shower. We'll just put a single waterproof speaker in the shower. And then the other one that Kevin's been helping me with is on the exterior, because of the proximity of our urban homes and suburban homes and how close they are, that you actually want to add a lot more speakers to the outside, because that way you can keep it at a lower volume. You just don't want to have the big boom box, one speaker on top of the roof blasting the neighborhood. So I think there's some really important things that the architect and Kevin's engineering team can do at the front end of the project to really design it well, get the right infrastructure in, and really be ready to put the music where it needs to be heard.
Right. And it's funny because it's one of those things that it's kind of opposite of what it sounds like it should be. More speakers doesn't sound like it should be quieter.
Yeah.
But I always explain to people, it's like lights. When you walk into a room, if there's 2 can lights, if I want to light this whole room, I got to crank them way up to get to the edges. But if I put 4 more cans well, then everybody gets a little of everything, and it can be turned down. And music is basically exactly like light. It goes where, the wider the dispersion, the louder you have to play it. And so outside is one of those that, nobody wants to get yelled at. I mean, I think we've all seen, the TV shows of the movie stars, and the neighbors are throwing stuff over the fence because they're loud. And, in most of these houses, even the bigger ones that we work on that are on a big estate, I mean, they're not that big, right? I mean, even if it's an acre, it doesn't take much volume to play that far. It is one of those things that trial by error, right? Is at this point in my life, after doing it as long as I have, when I go to a client and say, we really need to do 2 pairs of speakers out on your patio, and they're like, I don't need 2 pair, I just need 1. It's like, listen, 2 pairs significantly better just for keeping the volume down and getting coverage. And, I don't know if it's my old age or what, but you kind of get to a point where you're like, you got to get on the program. It's like, trust me, I've done it. You're not going to like it. But the client's always right eventually.
You talked about engineering a little bit, and you talked about design a little bit. And I can imagine a family that's building a $500,000 home, all of this stuff that might not be top of mind, right, for them.
Sure.
Person building a $10 million home, okay, they're definitely having the team involved. and the engineering done and the design work done from the AV standpoint. Maybe you can explain a little bit for that person who's building that $500,000 home. Why is the engineering and design so important from the beginning?
Right. Well, you would never build a house without an architectural drawing. And nowadays, especially in my business, I mean, 15 years ago, there were companies, right? I mean, we have stores, we have a corporate office, with a warehouse. Nowadays, most of the people that do what I do, it's, the three of us start a company tomorrow. We can buy 90% of the equipment that we sell through distribution. So, I mean, literally tomorrow we could be in business. The benefit to engineering, and for a guy that's been in the same company for so long, I mean, I just was out at a client's house. We did the original build 15 years ago. He finally sold the house. The new clients bought it. Well, it's a 15-year-old system in a $12 million house. Well, nothing works, and they want to put in new stuff. Well, I can pull out this drawing, and it tells me what wires I have to where. It tells me how many of them I've got there, where they come from to. But even if it's an inexpensive house, I work with a spec builder here, two of them actually. And we basically sit down with the floor plan, and I just use pens and go, this gets this is the MEC. We pick where it's going to go. We put in a couple of 20 amp dedicated circuits, and then we basically pick all of the wire and where it goes. And so at that point, even for this thing, which it's not a CAD drawing, it's not fancy, but at least it knows that behind every TV, there's an RG6 coax, and there's two cats, and they know where they come from. And if you're using it, for example, a lot of times nowadays, what we're doing is we'll put a little cable box right behind the TV and then put a Sonos soundbar under the TV. You're done, right? You turn the TV on with the cable box, you talk to it, use the Sonos app for music. It's simple. But what happens if I want to add an Apple TV now? Well, I can just plug it in, but do I put it on Wi-Fi? And it'd be nice if I had wired network for it. Or what if I want to use the apps in the TV? It'd be nice if they were wired network. So there's a lot of that stuff that having documentation, just so you know what's there for the future, is a huge thing, because hooking it up the day you move in is one thing, but you'll always change it, and you'll need to do service on it, and you'll need to do updates eventually. And I can't tell you how many times we walk into a house and there's a 6-inch bundle of wire hanging out of the wall. You have no idea where any of it goes.
Yeah.
And it takes you a couple of days just to figure it all out. And then if there's a problem, I've seen wires that, they steal it and they move it and it doesn't get labeled and nothing gets updated. And so you're just trying to figure it out as you go, which is never fun.
Yeah, and I think even on the $500,000 home too, Chris, that it can just be simple things like putting an outlet where you're going to put a camera, so you don't have to do a battery pack and have to change that. Just kind of thinking about all the different things. And what Kevin does is he integrates it all into one dashboard and creates a system. But there's also a lot of plug and play options out there, the Ring doorbell and those kind of things that have cameras and auxiliary items, but planning for them and having the outlet, having the RG6, the cable, the Cat 6 or Cat 7 is just really paramount to good infrastructure. Are there things, Kevin, that you would say on a home like that you have to rough in for, even if they don't want to spend the money? Are there certain things that are just, regardless of the price point, that you think are just instrumental to livability and quality of a home, regardless of the budget?
Right. Well, and Cat 6 nowadays, I mean, like cameras, for example, even we're working with a Google guy right now that he wants to use Google cameras. Well, they have batteries in them, and then they do PoE. So if you have a Cat there, at least you can do some of these off the shelf pieces, which again, a lot of clients, light bulbs that I can, talk to my Alexa. There's a lot of this kind of over the counter stuff that we just can't. I mean, I can't deal with it. I don't know enough about it, and we don't sell it. But I would say if you're doing a house, no matter what budget it is, wire is inexpensive, and if you put it in while you're building a house, it's the best idea you've got, right? If you do Cat 5 and RG6 to TV locations, if you do a couple of wireless locations in closets for access points, if you do network to the doorbell, Ring, for example, like you said, I mean, they came out with this doorbell that basically is on the Wi-Fi. Well, they have a brand new one that just came out in the last year or so. That's hardwired network, and they're coming out probably within the next 6-8 months, basically a version for a door king, for a gate. So, if you have a client with a gate that they did 10 years ago, it calls the Panasonic phone in the house. And, everybody wants to get rid of all that. But what do I do? So a Ring doorbell, basically that can integrate to a gate or to a front door. I mean, those things are great. But all that stuff, if you can put it on PoE, power over Ethernet, I plug it into a switch and it works. And, if something happens to it, I reboot the switch and it fixes most of the time or whatever's wrong.
Yeah. One of the big things that I'm getting as a takeaway here is no matter what your budget is, if you're building a house or if you're planning to build a house or renovate a house, you should be talking to an AV specialist early on, right? That should be, add that to the list of people to talk to, right? Because
Sure.
you don't want to get too far down the line into design or into construction without even knowing what's out there or what's possible.
Sure. And, the I hate to say fussy, but the bigger, the more intricate the builds become. There's a lot of architects, right? They have a very specific idea what they want the room to look like. Well, in Washington, if you build a house on the lake and it faces west, you have to have shades. Mm-hmm. Well, unless you want the shade to be built into the window, which the architects never do, you have to have a plan for hiding the thing. And I see, time and time again where the house will basically be starting to get framed. And all of a sudden the GC will be like, oh, hey, by the way, it's time to start talking about low voltage. What are you guys thinking? And they're like, oh, well, we want double shades on all the bedroom windows. It's like, that's a 7x11 pocket. And, and the header is this close to the window. I mean, we can't do it. Like, what do you mean I can't do it? And so there's a lot of that stuff early on. And again, it might be they don't want it, or it might be that once they figure out what it takes to integrate it, they want to do a different plan, or maybe they switch to drapes, or, who knows. But if you don't talk about it early enough, and for me, the nice thing is like a guy like Mark, who's done it, and he's, we've all hit our, chipped our tooth on stuff. We know when a client comes to us that's building a house, you got to ask all these questions about, do you think you want all this stuff? And a lot of times the knee-jerk reaction is, no, I don't need that. And then as the house starts to get built, lighting, for example, is the first, because once they see that giant box in their, in the wall of their living room, and they're going to have some plaster or whatever, they're like, well, that's terrible looking. It's like, well, yeah, but you said you didn't want lighting control. It's like, oh, well, yeah, I definitely want lighting control now. Mm-hmm. And so at least if you can talk about it early on, they kind of understand what it is and what they're getting into, whether they decide, ultimately to do it or not. We've all seen that, right? That, God, I wish I would have done it. Well, yeah, sorry, but again, if you at least think about it, there's a lot of ways that I can protect you. I've got, obviously with where we're at, Amazon and Google, and between Amazon buying all of these different kind of over the shelf, cameras and light bulbs and remote locks and things, Wi-Fi that you can plug in yourself and kind of make work. We've got clients that are like, well, I'd really like to use this because I work on the team. And I'm like, that's fine, but we should probably wire for still a proper wireless network. Because if you move in and you're at work and your wife's trying to do something on the network and it doesn't work, and it's your network because you bought it, I can't help you. So there's a lot of times where that'll go down the road. And then eventually the client will be like, well, I don't want to be the IT guy. I want somebody else to be responsible. I want somebody else to get the calls. And that's generally where we'll come.
We've talked a lot about sort of what's available, right? What's available now, what people should be doing. But I want to spend a couple of minutes here talking about what you see coming in the future. What are some of the crazy sort of off the wall hypothetical things that could be happening 5-10 years down the road?
It's funny because obviously voice is becoming a thing. And, just like when we started the integration stuff 20 years ago, I'll never forget, I could basically and I still can, I could make it where you push a button, it turns on lights, does shades, turns on TVs, turns on audio, does volume. I can do all of these different things associated with one button push. And I think with voice, people are enamored with it. Some are, some aren't. But, like Apple TV, if you ever talk to your Apple TV, it's pretty slick. Being able to do that is just starting to happen with some of these platforms. I see some clients that would really like to use more voice. I haven't seen it work well to where I'd necessarily tell anybody that it's a great idea. But there's Josh AI, which has kind of been the leader in the clubhouse because of what it's basically built to be specifically for voice command. So it doesn't go to the internet. It's not controlled by Google. It's not controlled by Amazon. It doesn't sell advertising. It's just a voice control platform. They're definitely getting more integrated into some of these products. And, again, I think a hard part for me is I've been doing this a long time, but I'm also not super technical. I was the guy with a VCR with a piece of tape over it because I don't want the clock to be flashing, right? So there's a lot of this stuff that it's cool and it could do it, but I come from the other side where I just don't want the service issues. And I know, like my house, I've got a Crestron and Lutron system at my house. So I've got distributed TVs in 6 rooms. I've got 12 zones of audio. I've got a doorbell. I've got cameras. I've got HVAC integration. And whenever the remote doesn't work, I still hear my wife, that is damn remote. And, to her, it's just a remote. But the reality is it's turning on a TiVo in a closet 40 feet away and working a television and speakers and an in-wall subwoofer. So the complexity behind the scenes is the hard part. And a lot of this new tech, it always comes out as a kind of DIY, do-it-yourself version first, which they never really work well. And at this point, I think that's where a lot of this stuff's at, but it'll get better. I just don't know that I care, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
But people, I don't know about you. Would you want to, I wouldn't necessarily want to walk into a room and go, hey, turn on the lights. I can push a button. It's not that hard, but we're not our kids, right?
Yeah. How about in the TVs? Are you, is it the 8K TV? Is there anything that's blowing you away on televisions that, every time I get a new TV, I'm always blown away. Like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. And then you go over to your friend's house and they have even better. It's just it just seems like this nanotechnology and LED backlighting is just phenomenal. What else is happening in TV world?
It's funny because in the television world, there was plasma for a long time, right? And the reality is nowadays life cycles are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. It used to be if I bought a TV, I'd keep it for 10 years, 15 years, long time. Nowadays, the average lifespan of a TV is like 4 years. People buy a different one or they'll get a bigger one. Our bedroom, I put a 55-inch TV in our bedroom and my wife's like, why didn't we buy a bigger TV? It's like, how much bigger do you want to get? It's like, well, we can put a 65 in here. I'm like, okay. But TVs are getting bigger. The 4K resolution as it is, it's once we jump to 4K, it's pretty awesome, right? The resolution's really good. But once we went from plasma to LCD, the big issue was trying to get black levels and trying to get the picture to look as natural, because plasma was a really good kind of solution for that. The OLED, which is also out, is probably the best version of it that has natural kind of look to it and the best black scale. Samsung, I think, as a company, and I don't know for sure, but OLED was basically LG created the technology and has licensed it, and Sony and LG are kind of big into the OLED stuff. Samsung went a different route. I decided not to do OLED, so they went 8K. And so if you're a client and you're walking into, which realistically most people buy TVs from either Costco or a Sam's Club, whatever, they're going to walk in and they're going to look at all these TVs on the wall and they're going to be like, well, this is a 4K OLED for $3,500. Well, this one's an 8K for $29.99. Well, it's got 4 more Ks. Like, get that one. And in the grocery store, they look fine. What you don't realize about them is, what all is going on in there versus what's going on in the OLED. And as far as if you calibrate it correctly, the black scale is way better. People just don't know, right? They don't go shopping. We're from Washington, so Magnolia Hi-Fi was here. And it was an awesome, actually, do you guys have something like that on the East Coast? Like a big retail store?
Through Best Buy, perhaps?
Best Buy, probably, yeah.
Well, so Best Buy bought Magnolia Hi-Fi. So when you walked into Best Buy and saw Magnolia Hi-Fi, I had a Magnolia Hi-Fi across the street from our store. And they had all the coolest stuff, and they had professionals, right? When you walked in there and asked the guy about a TV, he could explain the differences. Mm-hmm. Once it got put into Best Buy, they just bought it because they wanted the higher end brands. But you don't have that technology. You don't have somebody to explain what you're looking at and why. And in our store, I mean, we've got, I don't know, 10 different TVs on display. There's not a lot of margin in televisions, but all the stuff that hooks up to it, you got to kind of have a solution, right? So we sell televisions, and if you're going to sell them, you got to understand what the differences primarily are between them and what they do good or bad. Samsung is a great manufacturer. The TVs are cool because they're super thin. The bad news is they have this goofy box that all of the pieces and parts in have to be attached to it. So now all of a sudden I've got a box that's like 13 by 10 by 2 that I got to find a spot for. And it has to be within like 15 feet of the TV. So it comes with a little bit of its own challenges that way. Sony obviously is still Sony. They're great. If you like to use the apps in a TV instead of having cable or Apple TV or a Roku, I think Sony's probably done the best job because they still have a remote that's got real buttons on it, not an online GUI. But then there's also like we've got video wall technology, direct LED walls now, like Samsung's wall that they're $500,000. But basically, it's a direct pixel. You think about a television, the amount of pixels on it. This one behind me is about 12 feet wide. It's 4K. So the resolution on that display is the same as your 55-inch Sony TV you bought for $699. This thing's $80,000. But in general, we put them in car dealerships. We put them in commercial spaces where you want big, bright, and then the resolution's getting better, and we'll start seeing more of it kind of move into the resi world. But, at this point, they're still really expensive. But Samsung has them, Sony has them. They're all moving to that type of a technology. But the other thing you don't realize is when you walk into most houses, like an 85-inch TV is big. And if I'm going to sit in my family room, which is about 17 feet square, an 85-inch TV is kind of too big. Until the resolution gets much higher, which means you can sit closer to stuff, it kind of becomes a little distracting because it's so big. So we're kind of at that influx where once the video resolution gets higher, we don't need 3D because what gives you depth of field and makes it feel like 3D is resolution. And so once I get that higher resolution and I can see the depth of the image, we'll get there eventually. But it's kind of a weird. Like processes nowadays, a lot of these new projects that Mark and I work on, they're 3 to 5 year build cycles. Mm-hmm. And you'll talk to a client about a TV for, $2,000. Who knows what they're going to be in 4 or 5 years? They could be $6,000 because there's some brand new thing that you've never heard of, or they could be $1,900 and, it's basically a new, cheaper version. I mean, it's amazing though too. I mean, like an 85-inch TV, when they first came out, they weighed about 600 pounds, and now they weigh like 180 pounds. It's like, well, they didn't add more to them to make them light, right? They're figuring ways to take stuff out and still make the client happy about it. So we're in the middle of a cycle, which I think is kind of interesting with TVs as far as kind of the build quality and the construction costs. But I'm blown away by the prices every Monday. It seems like they come out with a new version and they update the pricing. So we'll see.
I like when you said that the life cycles is about that 4 to 5 year range, because I was thinking, the TV in my living room is about 5 years old. Maybe I should be talking to my wife about going and getting a new one.
Well, and think about it. I mean, 5 years isn't that long. And I mean, I was sitting there, after watching your guys' podcast, the last one about houses, which for the funny thing is the AV guy, right? I see all of the stuff and I appreciate it all. I've done, some remodels at our house, and I've seen a lot of houses, and so I have opinions on all of it, and things I like, things I don't like. But watching your guys' podcast was super intriguing because of all of the things I thought kind of went into it and things that you have to figure out. To me, it's super intriguing. And again, obviously my portion of it is kind of a small section of it in general for the budget, but because it's a, complete one-off design build pretty much every time, it does make them, it's hard to do. It's definitely harder to do.
So the house is built, people are living in it, a couple years go by. What can people expect for maintenance and investments and keeping the systems up to date and maintaining the systems Is there a financial aspect that they should be planning for, or a time aspect, or what do you think?
Excuse me. In general, when these things are in and they work and they're done and they're programmed, you really don't mess with them unless something breaks. And in general, like lighting control and shades, the reason they have a 8-year warranty is because it just doesn't break. The AV portions of it nowadays, because everything's a computer, it just, you reboot it, and in general, you're back up and running again. So nowadays, everything's, amplifiers, streaming portions, everything's got chips in it. It's like your laptop. Except you never turn it off, right? So eventually you got to reboot stuff. And a lot of the systems, what we put in, there's a lot of things nowadays that I can put in and program to reboot systems at 3:00 in the morning. So on the, first Tuesday of every month, we'll have the main processor power cycle. But nowadays, also through some of the things that we have access to for service, we have the ability to remote into your house and reboot power conditioners as well. So there's a lot of IP control that we have. Networking, for example, if the network doesn't work or the Apple TV's blue, in general, if I power cycle it, it works again. If it doesn't, we have a service department. That's one of the things that we have that realistically nobody that we compete against does, is we have a 5-person service department. But after being around as long as we are or have been, and doing as much business as we do, it all breaks, right? It all breaks. It all needs to be replaced, whether it be 10 years or 15 years. Again, I've been here that long. So, I've got clients that I put stuff in 15 years ago that we redid it 8 years later, kind of halfway. And then now we are, 8 years later, again, like completely replacing it all. Lutron, for example, end of life from 15 years old. The stuff hasn't been built in 6 years. So as it starts to fail, you now have to go in and basically replace it all, which some clients are like, oh, okay, great. This is kind of part of the whole thing. Other people don't like that they spent $60,000 on something 15 years ago, and now they're basically just going to replace it, and it does the exact same thing, but it's new and it has a warranty again. So a lot of the AV portions of projects, how systems got used. Like Panasonic phone systems, right? Nobody wants a corded phone in their house anymore. But if somebody rings the doorbell, other than walking down to the door, is there a way that I can, see who's there without having to go to the door? And, because nowadays, most of the time it's packages, right? And so for a lot of these systems, there's some kind of cool upgrade paths with some solutions that I think are pretty neat for folks. But in general, unless it breaks, there's not really a lot of routine maintenance for things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking back to the old intercoms that were throughout houses of all different levels that had the radio built into it, and just the doorbell with the light, and just how that's all changed. But the technology has just evolved. You still need a doorbell, whether it's a ring or a push button.
Yep.
And I think that's where you just, as anything in home management, you need to be able to upgrade. A smart thing to do is to put Smurf tubes in, where you can run from your TV over to the main equipment center. Like Kevin used the MEC, so you can have a provision in there for a future, run an extra spare wire. Really just kind of future-proof as much as you possibly can, knowing that it's probably going to be totally out there. You're not going to get it right completely, but at least you'll have that infrastructure or gateway in there to be able to adjust and adapt to the new technologies, because it seems like it's always changing for sure.
Right. Well, and 15 years ago, I remember people going, I don't need that. It's all going to be Wi-Fi. And here we are 15 years later, and everybody's like, it's all going to be wireless. And the big issue that people don't realize is if you think about the amount of things in your house that are trying to get on your Wi-Fi, it used to be maybe you had an iPad, or, what else? What else set on your Wi-Fi? Your laptop, maybe your phone. And nowadays, you'll walk into houses sometimes and there'll be 50 devices pinging the network, but it'll also be 30 devices from your neighbor's house. Yes. Now they can get on your network, but they still take up bandwidth trying to get into your network. And people just don't realize how much traffic is out there. And, iPhones, iWatches, all of that stuff, any, wireless transmitters for security nowadays, doorbells, cameras, all of these things sit on a network. And the reality is when they're all on your Wi-Fi network, if something locks up, unless you go over and unplug that thing, they're kind of hard to maintain. And that's where a lot of the over-the-counter stuff becomes, it's neat. I can go to my phone and make the light bulbs blue, but if it doesn't work, like I got to go over and turn it off and turn it back on. And, if you're in a family, I know where my wife is. I mean, it's a no-go. I mean, so for me, and what I try to do is, it has to be reliable. Number one, it's, in general, I don't ever want to do work. I guess I've been doing it long enough, and I don't want to do work for money. I want to do work that's reliable, that looks right, that functions right, that I know long term. When I run into the clients in the grocery store, they're not going to look at me like, that SOB. They're gonna be happy. And I mean, again, it's part of where I am in my life, maybe, but it's, these systems should be fun. Nobody needs this stuff, right? I mean, I can walk around and push buttons. I don't need a gate. I don't need, the light to turn on and off by itself. But if you want that to happen, it should be something that's thought out and that people are putting it in with an understanding that it's not going to cause you grief moving forward in your life. And I think there's enough stuff out there that, we run into that's painful that I don't need to cause more.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Before we wrap things up, I got a couple quick questions here. Number one, what's the service area that your company covers? I think we, for our listeners, we should point that out.
Sure.
So that if they're within your area, they can call you up and hire you.
There you go. I mean, in general, we have a store in Tacoma, which is, in the area where we're at in Washington. Tacoma is about a 45-minute drive south. Gig Harbor, Tacoma area, and then obviously Seattle, Bellevue is kind of the metropolitan areas, which is where most of our work is. Because we are, our company started life as a high-end 2-channel shop over by University of Washington. And our bread and butter and our backbone is still performance audio. I mean, I have a room with a $500,000 2-channel setup in it. It's got a $100,000 turntable. So we still have some of that DNA. When I sell integration, for example, I want to integrate things that sound good and look good. I don't want to just integrate stuff. And a lot of things nowadays, speakers, for example. I mean, there's a lot of brands that just make what I would call builder grade speakers. And a client never gets to hear them until they buy the house and they move in, and they're terrible. And they just assume that's what they sound like. And so the nice thing here is, I've got, any name brand out there, Bowers and Wilkins or Paradigm or Focal, they basically all want to be here because we're the only company in town that has a showroom. So pretty much anything that's out there that we would like to sell, we get, which is nice. But we definitely try to be more of a performance oriented. I'll put a pair of in-ceiling speakers in or an invisible pair of speakers in, but I want to pick the invisible speakers that sound better than just the other ones. And I want to integrate them into a point where they are in the right spots. One of the things that drives me insane, we do a lot of theaters. Well, surround sound in general means speakers have to be in the right planes. So you can't put the front speakers in the ceiling, side speakers in the ceiling, and the rear speakers in the ceiling, because that's not how surround sound works. It just, at that point, everything's playing from the ceiling. There's no side, there's no rear, there's no front, there's no height channels. There's just music, noise coming out of the ceiling. So I see it all the time where people will do a 9-channel Atmos and they're all in the ceiling. Well, that's not real. But again, the client thinks it's cool, but that's because they just don't know. And the AV guy wants to sell 9 speakers, so he's not going to say anything. But the reference theaters, movie theaters are definitely starting to be kind of more of a thing again. Destination rooms, which has been fun for us because we do a lot of that business as well.
And one last question here that I have is if you're talking to a homeowner who's planning on designing a house, building a house, or renovating a house, what is one thing that they can do to have a more successful project?
Oh, pre-wire and plan. And, like I said, even if all it is taking a set of floor plans and marking them up yourself so that that's what gets put into the house, that'll serve you well no matter what. I mean, it gives you a roadmap that if you're going to bother doing it, you might as well know what it is and where it is. And if you have, wherever you are, for me, I meet with people all the time, and my business is all, referrals, all word of mouth. So if a client says, hey, I can't hire you guys, or I'm going to have the electrician just do it, I would still spend 20 minutes with them and go through and mark up the floor plans for them and tell them what I think they should do. Because I'd rather them have a good solution than not. And, at that point, you never know when they'll come back or if they have friends or, it's a small world, man. Everybody seems to find out they know everybody eventually. And I'd rather be the guy that was helpful than not.
That's well said. And I think, the infrastructure and just being prepared. One thing that I always think about is I kind of use it as the guest experience. So I feel like my kids are guests at my house, and they tend to not use any of the apps because they're all on my phone. And so if your guest is coming to the house, the TV needs to be simple to turn on. The lights need to be simple. The simple is like I said, it takes some difficulties to create the simplicity. But I think if you just think of the user experience, we all just want to hit a button. I really don't want to know what the remote's doing. I just want to be able to turn the TV on. And I think that's kind of my lens on these projects, is that I don't want the guest to hit 4 buttons and then the shades are going up and down and they're like, well, and you need a manual. These are homes and they need to be livable. And so using people like Kevin to design it so that it's simple living, but has, high value, I think is really important. So I think the client meeting is just to be able to drive what they want and what kind of experience they want in their home and how they live, and then have Kevin develop the program to make that happen, I think is a really big part of it.
Sure. Well, and there's always feedback too, right? I always like the fact that they come in and, part of their team is the contractor and the architect and all these people and friends. And I like the fact that they come in, we can kind of expose them to all this stuff, and then they can go back, have conversations, because it's funny what people, they'll talk to the guys on site, like, what did you do? What did you see? What do you think? They'll talk to all these people. And my favorite is when you get a phone call from somebody on site going, hey, the client was here. They think this is really cool. They didn't necessarily love that. And partly it's, they don't know, or maybe they don't want it. But in the end, for me, the faster we can get to a point where the client gets what they want, and if they think they want it, but they don't understand it, how do you explain it to them? The better we can do a job of that to explain it to them, so that if they say no, they definitely understand what they're, not getting. I think it's the best for everybody. So that would be my key, is just, we're all in it together, pulling in the same direction.
That's fantastic. Well, Kevin, Mark, thank you for a wonderful discussion. And I hope that people have learned something here today. And I hope that when if you're building a house or buying a house or renovating a house, go talk to an AV specialist before you make any decisions. I think it's
perfect.
Worthwhile.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, fellas.